All right, we will now call the meeting of the Waco MPO Policy Board of January 20th, 2022 to order at, I want to say 2:23 p.m. MPO staff, has this meeting been posted?
Yes.
Does the Waco City Council or any other council need to be called into session?
Sure, we'll call a meeting of the Waco City Council to order at 2:22 p.m.
Now moving to our public hearing section, we provide an opportunity for the public to address the MPO Policy Board on any agenda item. Please complete a speaker's registration card with MPO staff. Speakers will be allotted one presentation at the beginning of the agenda for each agenda item the speaker wishes to address. Please note, each action item will have a separate public hearing later in the agenda. Speakers have the option of addressing the board at either time, but you'll only be allowed one opportunity to address the board per agenda. For items not on today's agenda, there is a separate hearing of visitors at the end of the meeting. MPO staff, do we have any registered speakers today? Any registered speakers?
No.
No, okay. All right, with no registered speakers, we'll move on to agenda item number 3 and consider approval of the minutes of November 18, 2021 MPO Policy Board. Any comments, objections, or other items of note on the minutes? If not, they will stand approved as presented. And without further ado, we'd like to introduce our new MPO director, Dr. Mukesh Kumar. If you'd welcome him with me. Dr. Kumar joins us from Mississippi, is that right? And recently joined us here in Waco McLennan County with his family, and we're delighted to have him, and we'll turn it over to you for some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. So I've been here just short of 2 months so far. And I want to start by noting with tremendous amount of glee about the previous director, Chris Avilia, who most of, I think all of you here have been very familiar with him. And one of the important things that I noted once I arrived here was the fact that, I want to talk about this. So there's a tremendous foundation that I found myself waiting for me so that I could work off. So that it was not so much as going to reinvent anything. It was a tremendous amount of work that he had already done over the last 2 decades. And then the next thing along with that, every time you move for a new position, quite often one of the most important concern you have is the colleagues, new colleagues that you're going to be working with. And I couldn't possibly have found a better set of colleagues to work with. And I think all of you are familiar with both Annette and Chelsea who are here. And I do want to acknowledge that what a tremendous work they have been doing for the last 6 years, much before I came. And so it has certainly made my life much easier. But at the same time, I also want to acknowledge that each one of you on the policy board, you were kind and generous enough with your time and thoughts, and each one of you spent time with me and have gotten me a lot of understanding of what the Waco MPO's role is and how we're moving in the McLennan County. And so I couldn't thank you enough. In fact, I do want to make a very quick note of how wonderful have you been that 2 of you have actually shared your personal books with me because you realized that I could actually learn something about Texas Triangle or the I-35 booming corridor. And one of you actually invited me for a very barely awake hour of 7 o'clock to come and address your Rotary Club. So it has been, hopefully I was awake enough to actually talk about the MPO, but it has been wonderful. And I can't, what I would love to do is that from the base that we already have, from the wonderful skilled colleagues that we have at the MPO, I want us to start thinking about how we can contribute even more for the future of the region. So yes, thank you.
All right, well, we're so glad to have you here and glad you're getting settled and getting to know the board and our community. So welcome again. Next, we'll move on to a discussion regarding preliminary analysis of 2020 census data for McLennan County and its impacts on TMA designation. I'll again turn it over to Dr. Kumar.
So when, before I joined here, there was a discussion that I distinctly remember Ms. Emerson asking me this question about the TMA status and what might it mean and why this was so important. And Mr. Bell also had asked and informed me about it. So when I got here, that was one of the first things I wanted to find out. Where do we actually stand on the TMA status? And based on the 2010 census data, when we updated the number for 2017, and this is the map from Texas Demographic Center, we stood at 186,000 plus residents at that point in time. We decided to update based on the same early boundary that we have. And based on that calculation, with the UZA boundary of 2010, we found that our population is 198,000. These are estimated numbers, so we should not go with great precision, but just over 198,000 people. We also decided to go ahead and calculate the estimated 2020 population for each of the constituent local government that is included as part of our UZA. And based on that, we find our estimate to be about 204,000 plus. So what it means effectively is that we are definitely at the very cusp, and there is a very fair chance that we will get designated as TMA. And Bureau of Census has this timeline schedule so that we will know exactly when to expect what. So in spring of, so actually this is going to happen in July of this year, that they will issue a Federal Register notice at which they will declare what the exact UZA boundaries are and what the populations are, and that will become our official number. So once we see the number in July, we will know for sure whether we are going to be a TMA or not. And once it happens at the end of sometime in fall, so most likely it will be in October, FDA, actually USDOT, so both of FDA as well as Federal Highway Administration, they make a joint declaration and put it and informed all the MPOs that have been designated to be TMA. And so the reason why this is important to us is because there have been some changes in the criteria of how the UZA boundaries are estimated. There have been changes in what we consider the hops, what is included. So the length of the hop has decreased to half a mile. It used to be 1.5 miles, if I recall. So these are the 7 changes that have been made. But the point I wanted to really stress on us is that whether we get designated to be TMA or non-TMA, if we get designated to be TMA sometime in fall, within 18 months, we'll have to come up with a CMA, and that will require us to think differently about how do we manage congestion within the area. But most important part is here that whether we become TMA or non-TMA, our national association has a motto in which they say that if you don't know where you're going, any plan will do. And so what is important is that we need to start thinking about where do we want to be as a region over the next 15 to 20 years. So in order to do that, here are some things that I wanted to share with you related to some of the very positive data that I've noticed since we started doing some of the analysis. So this is this goes all the way back to 1870, but what I want to point out is, look at the last 3 decades. In the last 3 decades, that leveling off is the very predictable pattern of population growth within the McLennan County. And all the area above the line is the city of Waco, and all the area above, below the line is city of Waco, and the remaining area is above the line. And what we notice here is that it is right at about 50%, what it tells us is that our core city has not only stabilized, but is right at about 50% of the overall county population, or MSA. And it's a very healthy pattern of growth, because in some areas of Midwest and Northeast United States, especially, we are beginning to notice that there are a lot of metropolitan areas start growing, but the core city does not. And that's usually a very unhealthy way of developing, which results in much worse problems for the overall region. But we are growing in a very healthy manner in which the city of Waco is growing alongside McLennan County at almost the same rate, with overall projection that it will remain at the same 50%. I also wanted to look at where some of the new growths are happening, and so we pulled down the permit data. And based on the permit analysis, we noticed that over the last 7 to 8 years, almost 70% or plus 70% plus permits on residential units have been issued in city of Waco. This again gives us a very strong notion that we are in fact growing in a healthy manner. And what it means then also is that we are going to be a city or an urban area where the mobility needs are going to also start shifting, in the sense that we'll have to start thinking about how do we accommodate different kinds of mobility needs of different people, but at the same time knowing fully well that with that comes the positive growth that we expect. Because this is the growth pattern we want to be able to sustain it. We want to be part of that enabling system so that we can make sure that this keeps growing in this healthy manner for quite some time. So one of the things that we have been able to generate is based on 2019 data, that there are a whole bunch of new mobility corridors that are coming up, which did not exist before. And so what it means for us then is that we want to make sure that these mobility corridors are actually not only get formed, but also get influenced for their future accommodation in a manner so that we can plan for it today. So in order to do that, however, what is important is, and I think I have mentioned this to several of you in our meetings, that we need to think strategically about where do we want to go and what role is MPO going to play in this. So you're already quite familiar with a bit of these issues about how transportation now has started moving away from single-minded focus on cars-driven mobility to all different kinds of mobility patterns that we're noticing. So now we are thinking more about mobility and access to mobility and correspondingly about the alternative modes of transportation, and that relate directly to our issues of safety, urban growth, community development, social equity, land use, economic development, and such. So I'm sure that all of you have heard this 3C process, and as an MPO, this is our responsibility to make sure that we provide a framework in which we have a cooperative, continuous, and comprehensive planning process that we do. But the thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that until now, we have been small. Small as in our urban region itself has been small. What it meant was that we had significantly less amount of resources available to us. And so the process we have been following is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And this is in our MTP. And in this process, what we do is that we take a wish list of projects, and then we start funneling it down based on financial constraint, based on efficiency, based on some of the measures that we have, and reduce it down to some small number of projects that we end up funding. And that has been our planning process. But when we look at what we are mandated to do, and so the document I have on the left-hand side of the screen is what the Federal Highway Administration puts out in the briefing book for all MPOs, that this is exactly what the planning is supposed to be. And so we have been, three of us have been arguing and debating about how do we move from the right-hand side, the funneling process, into a proper planning process that we are actually supposed to do. And so Annette put this together very nicely, that within this prescribed process, what we notice is that we actually do a mighty fine job of the areas that are highlighted in between, from long-range planning, short-range planning, and enforcement management. And it has served well so far. And there's nothing wrong with what we have been doing. But as we move forward, what is also going to become important for us is to collectively have this argument about the regional visioning process. We have to know the kind of region we are going to become, we want to become, so that we can start making our decisions accordingly. And that's the very top block about regional visioning process. And based on that, immediately comes the next step, that we need to know how do we evaluate all the different transportation strategies that we could employ in order to meet and achieve that vision that we could do. And so that's where strategic planning comes into the play, that we really need to be strategic about how do we move forward. So the point is that we have done a very good job of where we are now. We also have done a very good job of what will it take and how did we do. We do a good bit of our own measurements, but what we also need to find out is where do we want to go. And in order for us to do that, once we have that idea, we can figure out how do we get there. So the way we think that we need to move forward is that within the plan, from the policy board, this is one of the three asks that I have of you today. is I would like you to create a work group of strategic planning work group. And this work group is going to then work with three of us within the MPO so that we can set the direction of the MPO over the next 3 to 4 months. This work group, what I expect it to be, I would like this work group to be established in February, meet twice a month for the next 3 months. And based on that, we would have a proposal for you that this is the strategic plan that we have for the MPO. This is the direction you want the MPO to move forward to, so that we have clarity on the path that we're going to be taking. We have some initial thoughts and suggestions for you, what this work group might be. In a moment, I'm going to talk about our technical advisory committee, and it is important that we bring them into the fold as quickly and with as much integration as possible. And so ideally, this work group should really have 2 members from the policy board, 2 members from the TAC, and possibly 1 additional member from the citizens. So let me talk very briefly about my second ask from you, which is that one of the very first things that I was made aware of that our technical advisory committee, TAC, has been doing. We're not using the tremendous amount of skill set and tremendous amount of capacity and knowledge base that our TAC has. So we have been sort of shortchanging ourselves into not using them with as much efficiency as we could. So what is important for us is that, so first thing we want to do is establish a bylaws for the technical advisory committee. And so what we have so far is that we have drafted a bylaw for our TAC, and it is being reviewed by our federal partners and our state partners. And once we have that revision, we'll send it for review to the current TAC member. And once we revise it again, that's when I want to send it to everyone on the policy board. And what I would really expect you to, or would love for you to do, is to consider, make necessary changes and adopt a set of bylaws for the TAC at the February meeting. Once we have done that, then immediately following that, we would have TAC to also elect some of its chair and vice chair. And then I would like the chair of the TAC committee to come and make recommendations to you based on the considerations that they have done. This gives us a much more streamlined, integrated process with the entire region, so that not only the projects pop up based on needs and as the context changes, but also based on longer term thought processes that everyone on the TAC has communicated to me that they are the ones who actually sit and think through this stuff day in and day out. So we really do have a tremendous knowledge-based capacity in our TAC, and I want us TAC to actually be able to help the public policy board in a meaningful way. So here are some ideas about how we think the officers are going to be, but a lot of this is going to be in the draft bylaw that I'll be sending to you as in the draft form, so that you can revise it and hopefully adopt in February. So just to revise it, repeat it, these are the 3 asks that I have from you today. Number 1, that I do want you to establish a bylaw for the TAC. Second is that I would like you to create a strategic planning work group by your February meeting. And also, I do want your consent. In many ways, I've already communicated to you in person that in more ways than one, I would like you to be the group that leads the regional visioning process. Not the MPO, but you, and you are the MPO. And in that sense, this regional vision has to be entirely yours. And in many ways, I would like you to agree to lead that process of visioning, so that we can take McLennan County where it needs to be. So with that, I think it'd be time, if you have more questions at the end, we can certainly, but if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer. Yes?
I have a question. For the strategic planning group, I mean, I know strategic planning is strategic planning, but can you give a little meat to what you're talking about when what you're trying to get out of that strategic plan group?
Sure, absolutely. So some of the most important things are going to be, do we do a call for proposals or not? Do we do programs versus projects? If we are going to do proposals, what would be the boundaries of those proposals? What would be the process when these proposals come through? What our selection criteria is going to be? The process that we want to engage. Just to give you one example, that so typically when we start our MTP process, our next one, 2050, is 1 year prior to adoption. But this year we want to spend 2 years trying to engage the public in a more meaningful way through design. preferably using some design charrettes in the process of getting public to engage in it. And so we'll start the process about 3 years earlier rather than 1 year prior. And so strategic planning group basically lays out a lot of these paths, that this is the path that, that the MPO is going to be on for the next 3 years. So that's the most important part of it. But the regional visioning process is something that you will be driving. And so strategic planning group only is going to tell us that how would you, so for instance, it's easier to simply say that let's produce a regional vision. In fact, within the city of Waco, I'm very aware that there have been some visioning process that have been established with a core group of people, but although I'm not aware of any such effort that has been made across the McLennan County. And so it would be important that, that our strategic planning process establishes the steps that we will be taking so that we can achieve what the regional visioning process is going to look like, all the steps that we need to take to revise everything from calls for proposal processes to the selection criteria so that we can meaningfully engage. So that's roughly what it is. It's strategic planning with a small s.
Would you foresee that this strategic planning group presenting it to the board for adoption, or?
Yes, yes. So strategic planning group will meet with us twice a month, but they will come and present to the board at each of the meetings, but give a progress report. I expect them to last for 3 months, not beyond that.
Dr. Kumar, back on the transportation management area, the TMA designation, what would some of the benefits be to our region if we were able to get that designation?
So, so there's some category funding for which we're not eligible at this point in time, which will become eligible. In the next infrastructure bill that has been passed and that the federal government is still figuring out how to disperse the payments, and not all the things are set in place. There is some amount of funding that is available for TMA MPOs only. Rest of so I can correct me if I'm wrong, but non-TMA MPOs, often a lot of their funding decisions, some of their funding decisions are rested with Texas DOT. But once you're TMA, then you get to make decisions about your own preferences. So
more, you've got access to more funds, and you've got more control over where those funds go.
Yes, and also you are responsible for maintaining your condition management plan at all times, and that's the one which will become due 18 months after the designation. So we'll have to be prepared that if we were to be designated, that we are well prepared to start the process of developing the plan.
And we're waiting to see on the final census numbers to see if we get that designation.
Yes.
Josh, the amount of funds can be substantially more. You don't all necessarily go into specific projects. You can think like a non-attainment area for carbon, things like that. You can do things that are not necessarily turning dirt to increase or to decrease the attainment numbers, things like that. K-Tempo gets money for that we don't get up here in Waco. And of course, the larger metro areas get substantial amounts of money based on population, but it is a substantial funding increase.
Okay, thank you.
It will be noticeable to this policy work.
Do you have any questions from all the board members who are online?
No, Dr. Kumar, I haven't. Well, it's a small question. So with the strategic planning work group, since we have the whole county represented, is it meriting itself, since it's 2 policy members, to have one of our rural partners, and then what makes sense for that?
Sure. Thank you. The question is for the strategic planning work group, what might make most sense? I was in my initial thoughts, I was thinking that it would probably be one person who represents the city of Waco on the policy board, and another person who represents the rest of the McLennan County, and so that would be a terrific combination. And at the same time, we also want to be as diverse geographically as possible, and also based on what the different types of mobility need patterns that we see within the area. So that kind of diverse representation on the strategic planning work group would be good. Chelsea had something to add.
Yeah, so a question maybe for the group is how, like, will you be accepting nominations for the strategic work group, or like how will that be handled?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I would, in fact, what I would expect the policy board to make that decision for us. I don't want to prescribe a particular method you do, because this work group is your work group, and you're going to be selecting people from the policy board. You may in fact select, we can provide you with a list of people from the technical, from the TAC committee, the TAC as well, and you can choose, you can nominate yourself but ultimately, it's entirely up to you how you choose it. I'm sure you have chosen work groups before for different purposes. In this particular case, I think that the idea would be one person from the city of Waco, one person from Mentor of McLennan County, and then similarly from the TAC. Similarly, I think it would be useful to have, especially some people who are in the public works type of areas. And then I think I had some conversation regarding this also with the county engineer, and he had also expressed some interest in helping out in the process. But it is entirely the policy board's decision.
And if you're just joining us, our esteemed chair is in Puerto Rico on business, but he may be the guy that would lead that up. If you're interested in serving, would it be a good idea to email Jim Holmes or staff if you're interested in serving? Or because I think in terms of the timeline, the idea is to get this moving in February, right?
Yes, yes.
What do you think is?
So I think ideal would be to send an email to Councilman Jones and copy me on it.
Holmes,
yeah. So that I know that who are
for both kind of nominations or self-nominations or
yes.
willingness to serve, or think kind of a good idea
yes.
for someone to serve. So
yes.
Email Jim Holmes and copy.
Yes. And then we'll bring up all that. So one possible process could be that we bring up all the nominations at the February meeting, and then the policy board selects who are going to be on this work group.
I think it's a great point. If we want to do it, but I don't think we should do it today.
Any other comment, discussion on these two items regarding TMA and then this work group and kind of steering representation? All right, let's move on to our next agenda item. Review and discussion regarding Waco MPO support of public transportation asset condition targets calendar year 2022, established by Waco Transit System Incorporated. Yeah, in accordance with requirements identified as part of the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, known as the FAST Act. Pass it over to Annette. All right.
So I get the unenviable task of following up vision presentation with regular business. So in accordance with federal legislation, states, transit operators, and MPOs use performance measures to monitor how well the transportation system is meeting public expectations. For instance, whether the performance of the system is getting better or worse over time. Performance results can tell us whether the types of investments and strategies we're implementing help us achieve our access and mobility goals that we set in our long-range plan, the MTP. So some of those goals are like system safety, access to regional population employment, cultural and recreation centers, and the health of the regional economy. Performance results also help us identify current and future transportation needs. You saw an illustration of this in Dr. Kumar's presentation, the green feedback process loop. The intent of the legislation is that transportation investment decisions made by decision makers like yourselves are based on data and evidence so that the investments remain realistic and achievable. So this is accomplished in part through the MPO's programs and our plans. The Federal Transit Administration requires 3 transit performance measures to be set annually that are related to the condition of transit equipment and facilities. And they provide parameters for doing so with a defined useful life benchmark ULB, you'll see on the slides, for transit vehicles. That's related to the age of our buses and vans. And then a term scale that's related to the condition of our facilities and their contents. This is not new. We've been over this for the past couple of years, so just refreshing your memory. Each year,
Sorry, performance.
yeah, you're fine. So each year, transit providers assess the condition of their vehicles and facilities relative to the FTA definition of state of good repair. The SGR is the condition in which a capital asset is able to operate at full level of performance, recognizing that as assets age, their level of performance declines. The process of setting TAM targets, transit asset condition targets, and then assessing their progress then gives transit providers a snapshot of the health of their assets and on an annual basis and then throughout their life cycles. This helps decision makers plan future investments at appropriate times, and it gives FTA guidance on the state of transit assets nationwide. So there's no penalties for transit agencies or MPOs for missing TAM targets, and also no reward for attaining them, but their information collected over time may affect changes in the process at the federal level, and it may also affect the types of projects that are selected by state DOTs. So we can't say how that might trickle down yet because performance management and the metropolitan transportation planning process has only been in place since 2018. So although there's no direct consequences to missing target, it isn't meaningless. So last year, Waco MPO supported Waco Transit's TAM targets for calendar year 2021. And in doing so, the MPO agreed to select a mix of projects that help Waco Transit achieve their asset condition targets. And this is reflected in the MPO long range plans and the MTP and the short range improvement program, which is the 21-24 tip. So last September, the Waco City Council accepted Waco Transit's TAM targets for the calendar year 2022. We see that in the fourth column of that chart. So I know that this chart is overwhelming, but what it boils down to is that despite the addition of several new vehicles during recent years, Waco Transit's remaining fleet continues to age, and with several vehicles passing the FTA's useful life benchmark in 2022. So basically it indicates that Waco Transit would have to replace 17 vehicles to reach its 2022 targets, but this is not to say that 17 vehicles must be replaced immediately. Aging vehicles are safe. It's just that you need to know that you need to recognize that as they age, they're more prone to unexpected mechanical failures. And that leads to a greater risk of delay for transit passengers. So this chart basically gives decision makers an annual snapshot of the condition of regional transit assets so that we can plan ahead for future improvements. It's especially important right now due to the chip shortages that are caused by COVID-19 supply chain disruptions. So that's just something that we all need to be aware of in the region. So, and then the bottom line of this chart shows that the Waco Transit facilities continue to score well for overall condition and have a relatively low percent of elements considered less than adequate. Doing well. So takeaways for this discussion is that Waco Transit uses the TAM process now as a guide for their replacement schedule. So although there was no vehicle purchase in 2021 and there's no plans in this year, there will be likely vehicle purchase within the next 2 or 3 years. And then a route realignment study is currently underway that you're familiar with, and the hope is that that also guides the types of vehicles that are purchased, and that study should conclude in a few months. So do any of the transit representatives that are on the line, do you want to add anything to this?
No, ma'am, Annette, you covered it clearly. We strive to replace our fleet based off of the federal funding that we receive and the local match. We do have some funding available to purchase some vehicles, but again, we want to take direction from the alignment study and see what's the best path forward with the next set of vehicles that we purchased. So we do have some funding, some 5339 funding available, but we are waiting to see which direction we need to move with those vehicles.
And for all of you here, that was Serena Stevenson from Waco Transit. Thank you. Okay, so the question that we'll ask you to weigh in on in February is, should Waco MPO support Waco Transit's adopted asset management targets for calendar year 2022? So MPO staff will gather input from our Waco area citizens and stakeholders over the next couple of weeks, and then we'll provide a staff recommendation to you in February.
Any questions or discussion on this agenda item? Move on then.
We're going to talk about the Public Transit Agency Safety Plan. So the FAST Act requires that each transit agency that receives federal funding, they are required to identify baseline safety metrics and performance targets that the agency can realistically accomplish. And we do that in the vehicle called the PTASP, or the Public Transportation Agency Safety Plan. So the intent of FTA is to better assess safety risk within transit networks. So the objective of a PTASP is to improve safety by proactively managing internal safety risk, better predict and reduce frequency of safety events, and then to ensure realistic safety improvements, guide funding prioritization. So Waco Transit initially adopted their safety plan in June of 2020. And then that plan is updated every 4 years or when revisions are required. And safety performance targets within that plan are set annually. And then MPOs is to demonstrate how projects identified in the MTP and the TIP are intended to assist in accomplishing those PTASP targets. So in 2021, the MPO agreed to select a mix of projects that help Waco Transit achieve their safety goals. And this is reflected in the MPO short range transportation improvement. There's what do we call it, Appendix C in the TIP that if you want to look at that, will show that the current TIP is in the FY 21-24 TIP, and will be referenced in the next long range plan amendment, and then in the next long range plan that we do. And that's because when we wrote the last MTP, this plan was not in place. This rule was not in place yet. So much of the Waco Transit's PTASP involves internal operational practices that are not part of the metropolitan transportation planning process, and they're not relevant to the MPO, but the portions that are relevant are targets regarding fatalities, serious injuries, number of safety events, and significant mechanical failures for both fixed route and demand response services. So each year, Waco Transit reviews its safety plan, and then in order to assess the safety performance, Waco Transit depends on data from the prior year from FTA. Well, FTA had not released the 2020 data at the time that Waco Transit's certification was due, so no refinements to safety targets were recommended. So last September, the Waco City Council adopted the same safety targets outlined for 2021 for 2022. But even without a full assessment, we can see that the number and rate of fatalities and serious injuries are low and it'd be difficult to improve on. So if the plan goal is to maintain low numbers of injuries and no fatalities, then this chart shows that safety goals and targets are in line. Okay, so the National Transit Database, which is short for NTD, we call it, you'll hear it, defines a major mechanical system failure as a failure of some mechanical element of the revenue vehicle that prevents the vehicle from completing a scheduled revenue trip or starting the next scheduled revenue trip. So as we saw in the previous slide, the City Council adopted the same mechanical failure rate for 2022 as they did for 2021. So we don't have 2021 mechanical failure rates for a full assessment. So we're looking at 2020 rates just to give you a snapshot of sorts. The 2020 failure rate is a bit on the high side, and it's related to the age of the vehicles that are being used, but this will improve over time with vehicle purchases.
And at where will we have the 2021 data?
So we'll have to ask Serena. And Serena may not even know this. So Serena, are you on the line?
I am. What we do each year is we have to complete an annual report that has it's due January the 31st, that I have all of the last year's data. And so generally around, June, May or June, or as soon as the FT, as soon as the feds complete their review of it, then they'll post it. Because we actually use the databases on the FTA website for transit to pull our data, because it has to be reviewed by them and approved. But we do each month report our safety incidents as well as our mechanical failures. So quarterly, we receive a feedback from NTD if we are outside of a 10% margin, so that we'll have to address that. So while we wait annually for the review each quarter, if we're over that 10%, they do provide us feedback so that we would know. So I'm thinking we'd get 21 sometime around June, and then when we come back to council, we would be about a year behind. But that's kind of just how our data goes. We're just like our grants, we may receive fiscal year 22's money in 23 because of the way our targets are rated.
Okay,
So thank you for that, Serena. So basically, it doesn't necessarily matter if we're a year behind. It's still going to roll up to FTA.
But Annette?
Yes.
Hi, so Serena, could we possibly get the information from those quarterly reviews, or am I to assume that since it's not mentioned, we were up under the 10% threshold?
Yes, ma'am. And so what we do is we update it off of the certified numbers from the FTA. And so while we submit it quarterly, if there was an issue or concern, then we would be addressing it immediately. But they certify the numbers, and then that's what TxDOT put in our plan, because we were in the TxDOT plan as a whole to use as our, baseline numbers. And so we try to stick with the baseline numbers that comes from these different resources, from the NTD data and FTA. So that's why we try to use those numbers to certify and present, so the baseline is consistent.
Gotcha, thank you.
And I'm assuming that was Councilmember Barefield?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, it was.
All right,
Sorry.
thanks. And if you want more information, just email us or Serena. We'll be happy to get you more information. All right, so how does the MPO help improve the transit system? So as we're developing our long-range plans, we need to be considering the condition of our regional infrastructure. The condition of pavements, lane markings, traffic signals, and signage are all important to transit operations. So the condition of our transit fleet and the severity of crashes is also something we want our decisions to favorably impact. So as decision makers, we should give priority to actions and projects that address those issues. So again, the question we'll be asking to weigh in next month is should Waco MPO or Waco Transit's adopted 2022 safety targets? And we'll be getting input from citizens, and we'll bring that back to you in February. Did we answer everyone's questions?
Move on. We have the review and discussion of Waco MPO roadway safety targets for calendar year 2022. Texas Department of Transportation, again, requirements as part of the FAST Act. Chelsea.
Thank you. All right, last of the 3 annual performance measures and performance targets. So this is roadway safety. For roadway safety, we have 5 performance measures that we track. That's the number of fatalities, the fatality rate, the number of serious injuries, the serious injury rate, and non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries combined as one measure. And these are reassessed and set again annually. So last year, just to remind you, Waco MPO supported TxDOT's statewide targets. This is something that we've done ever since we started reporting on these measures since 2018, I believe. So what that means when we say we support the statewide targets is we're agreeing to select a mix of projects that help the state achieve their targets. And we do that through our long-range planning, so our MTP, as well as the projects that are then programmed into our TIP, or the short-range plan. And as a reminder, we're not required to set our own targets. We have the option of supporting the state. And again, that's what we've done for the past few years. Each annual set of targets is independent from the previous years. We use a rolling 5-year average because that helps us, of course, to normalize some of the outlier years. Spoiler alert, you'll see 21 is hopefully an outlier year. And one thing I did want to note is last year, the Texas Transportation Commission started to implement the Road to Zero vision in these safety targets. And that vision is to reduce the number of deaths by half by 2035 and to 0 by 2050. So those targets are now reflected in these roadway safety targets. So here's what the statewide targets look for 22. This just shows you that from 2018 to 2020, those are the real numbers. 21 numbers aren't finalized yet, so that's still shown as the target. The 22 target is highlighted in yellow, and that 5-year reporting period expressed as a 5-year average is shown on the last line. Again, this is for the whole state. Next slide, please. But more of interest to us, of course, is how did we do, right? How do we do here in McLennan County? So these are our 21 numbers. They're preliminary, they're in red. They're preliminary because these came out of TxDOT's crash data system, CRIS, as of January 10, but it takes a couple of months for these numbers to get finalized. So that's what we know for now. And 2 questions: do we meet our targets? And do we do better than the baseline? So when we say our 2021 safety targets, we supported the statewide targets, but if we were to kind of take those numbers and see what they need for us regionally, this gives us some context to show how close or how far away are we from those targets. Generally didn't do too good for 2021. We did better than baseline slightly for the rate of fatalities. I will say that this is not unique to us here in McLennan County or Waco. It's not even unique just to Texas. Like overall in the country, 2020 and 2021 were particularly bad, unsafe years on our roadways. There's been some research done on it to date. They're still trying to figure it out, but the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration recently released a research brief, and they are finding that speed, traveling without a seatbelt, and impaired driving remain higher than average as compared to pre-pandemic times. So these are some trends that we started to see happen in 2020, continuing into this year. Let's move on. So the next slide just shows you the 5-year rolling averages, historical rolling averages, starting with our baseline period from 2012 to 2016, moving on to our current period. Again, that's in red because it's preliminary. But this is going to be easier to see if we move on in graph form. So these are fatalities, again, reported as those 5-year averages, generally trending up. Next slide. Fatality rate is interesting, and the rate is the number of fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. I'm pretty sure that dip is because the years 2015 and 2016 had a particularly low numbers for fatalities, and then 2017 started to creep up again, and again 2020 and 2021 were higher. Moving on, serious injuries were trending down, but creeped up again in this current period, 2021. The serious injuries were particularly high compared to previous years. It's 272 so far, which is off of the scale of this graph for the annual. And then the next one is the serious injury rate, trending down and pretty flat, but again, a little bit of a creep up for our current period because the 21 serious injury rate was particularly high so far at 8.5. And then the last performance measure that we look at is non-motorized. So these are bicycle and pedestrian crashes that involve a vehicle, clearly trending upward. This again is happening nationwide. I will say that we do have some figures for the state of Texas overall. Pedestrian fatalities in 21 were up 12% since 2020, bike fatalities up 10%, pedestrian serious injuries up 18%, and pedestrian serious injuries up 13%. So this is a problem. So that's where we've been, how it was last year. Looking to the future, what would it look like if we continue again this year to support the statewide targets? This chart is, or this table is for context, because again, when we officially as a policy board agree to support the statewide targets, we're not adopting this table, but this gives us an idea of like, what does that actually mean? How far are we from these numbers based on the numbers that we actually have here in our region? As you can see, the changes from 21 to 22 are pretty incremental, but in reality, especially if you look at the last 2 years, our numbers don't look like this. So what do we do about it? Moving on. So there are a number of things that we can do to help get us closer and help us help the state accomplish the statewide roadway safety targets. We know that we need to tackle this issue regionally and statewide because, like we've said, this is happening not just here in our region, it's happening in Texas, it's happening across the country. There are things that we can do at our MPO. You know, Mukesh was just talking about the regional vision process and the strategic planning. The meat of where we can really make an impact is how we prioritize projects and selection criteria in our long range plan, and then how we then program projects into the tip. What projects do we actually fund? Like that's how to directly make an impact. And we can do that through our project selection criteria that can specifically look at reducing fatalities and serious injuries, dive deeper into the crash analysis, circumstances, look at the proven safety countermeasures. There are reports out there. We can incorporate all of this into our next MTP cycle. And also we have a next TIP cycle coming up pretty soon. So these are our mechanisms that are kind of right at our fingertips to start addressing these problems. But it's also going to take a team approach, continuing to work with our partners at TxDOT, other MPOs, the Texas Transportation Institute, through peer exchange, data sharing. Next slide, please. And also currently what just started is a statewide safety task force. So the Transportation Commission, you know, recognizes that this is an issue. They need to put in some real measures to achieve their road to zero goals. So in August of last year, a new safety task force was started that has representation from the commission, TxDOT districts and divisions, as well as 7 different MPOs from across the state. And so we will be participating in this effort through our MPO representation. We have a Texas MPO Association that's very active. We have a lot of peer exchange and data sharing. So we will have a voice in this process to get the knowledge from them and to provide feedback up. So in both directions. Next slide. So it's the same public input schedule as the first 2 performance targets that you saw with our public meeting on Monday, and then coming back to you in February with our staff recommendation and asking you to choose to support the statewide targets if you do so. With that, any questions?
You mentioned the 3 reasons: speed, seatbelts, and you mentioned, I think it was impaired driving.
Yeah.
Is that like substance related, or is that with distracted like device usage?
I think that was substance. I think they have distracted driving as a different category. And this came out of a report that looked at the first 6 months of 2021. So it's kind of preliminary data, but they were saying that comparing to 2019 and earlier, the numbers are up. So we don't know yet, right? We won't know if this is pandemic related or these habits that people picked up during the pandemic when the roads were empty, right? And then just continued on. We'll have to see.
All right. Thanks so much, Chelsea.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Let's move on to discussion and updates from the Texas Department of Transportation regarding significant highway construction within the Waco metropolitan area. Are Clayton and or Victor online with us?
This is Clayton.
All right. Feel free to proceed.
Yes, sir. Go ahead. All right. First project here is actually an upcoming project. It's our Spring Valley job between Sun Valley and Hewitt Drive. It led in January. Big Creek was the low bidder at $15 million. We should start up spring of this year, looking at roughly a 2.5-year time frame. Next slide. All right, our Waco Drive ADA project. Currently working on signals and conduit in the Valley Mills area, working to the west. And then they've also got sidewalk going on the east end of the project. We're targeting a completion fall of this year.
Well, on that project, is the plan to install sidewalks for the duration of Waco Drive?
It's pretty much the entire duration from center point to 933. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much.
Yep. All right, 185. Contractor's been working on drainage structures primarily at this point. Once the weather kind of clears up, should see some pavement work ongoing spring into summer, and we're looking at being complete end of this summer out there. State Highway 31, again, this is a Weber job, so same contractor as the interstate, constructing the new overpass at the 939 intersection, along with widening 939 between 31 and Happy Swainer. Weber has installed a good portion of the embankment for the new bridge headers. They've started work on the new structure and are working on intersection work down below, looking at a completion date of summer of 2023 right now. State Highway 6, Small to Mall. Work has been ongoing at Bagby and continues to progress well there. Weber has installed the majority of the substructure, the drill shafts, and we'll actually be working on pouring the columns out in the center of State Highway 6 beginning of February. We're targeting setting beams mid-February, and then if things kind of go our way, hopefully by March, April, actually getting one of those U-turns open. With that job starting up here in the next couple of weeks, really hot and heavy, I wanted to provide a kind of a breakdown and structure of the contract. For this job, similar to the interstate, we led it as an A+B, where contractor bid both the cost of the work and the time. We set some constraints as far as traffic control goes. For example, we limited the number of turnarounds they could have closed at one time, and then we also applied some disincentive rates to some of our high impact closures. For example, we're going to be closing Imperial Drive and Exchange Parkway for a period of time. What we did is set a maximum time limit and then applied a disincentive rate if the contractor exceeds that time frame. If you go back, I'm sorry. Down on the bottom, I've broken down the 2 milestones on the job. The first is the completion of the 4 frontage road bridges at the railroad tracks. And then the second is the completion of the main lanes. I won't go into detail, but I've provided the road user cost per day along with the maximum days allowed per contract for each of those milestones. And this is how the bid came in according to those parameters that we set. Weber's bid came in at right around $55 million for the cost of the work. As far as milestone 1, which is completion of the frontage roads, you can see they came in at 400 days, so roughly 60% of the maximum allowable time by contract. And then they bid a substantial completion of 520 days, so roughly half the contract time that we had allowed. Again, similar to the interstate, we incentivize these milestones. If the frontage road's complete on time, it's a $750,000 bonus. Substantial completion has a $12,500 day incentive attached to it, along with an additional $1 million no excuse bonus if they complete up to 20 days early. So. All right, and then just kind of a breakdown of the project. It's really broken into 4 sections. The first one being here at the Bagby turnarounds. You can see in red what will be the new turnaround bridges and pavement. You can go to the next slide. You can go ahead and skip this one and go to the picture. It's a little easier to talk to. So step 2 is the frontage road bridges at Beverly, and this is what you'll see starting up on January 31st. In red, you can see the new frontage road bridges and frontage road pavement to either side of the railroad tracks. What will happen is Weber will come in on January 31st and actually shut down both turnarounds at this location, and that'll allow them to start on these new structures in the pavement. And this will probably be roughly a 6-month time frame for this particular step. You can go to the next slide and go ahead and skip this one. So this is step 3. So similar to what we're doing at Beverly, we're building the same frontage road bridges and crossings up closer to the Imperial crossing. So again, just like the second step, this is another 6-month duration roughly to get these frontage road bridges built. And you can move on to the final step here. It's constructing the main lane pavement. So once all 4 frontage road bridges are built, traffic will be detoured out to those new bridges, and then the main lanes will be built in the middle. Weber is looking into some options to potentially combine and overlap these phases. That has the potential to cut the time down even more. And as that information becomes available, I'll be sure and share it here. All right, moving on to the interstate. Through our December estimate, we're looking at $320 million of construction complete to date, still looking for a substantial completion date of late 2022. I know that Chairman Holmes had asked for this breakdown of days a couple months ago, so what I did here was list out our 3 milestones, the first being substantial completion. Again, our contract was set up with a 1,507-day maximum. I've included the incentive and bonus information here. Weber's bid came in at 1,150, and to date we've charged 786 of those 1,150 days. Milestone B1, which was the completion of the new southbound main lanes. This one has actually been completed. Again, contract allowed up to 482 days. Weber bid 340. However, there were some phase changes made after letting that adjusted those days to 443. And Weber actually completed in 381 days, so substantially early, and achieved their max bonus for that particular milestone. Milestone 2 is currently ongoing. It's the completion of the new northbound main lane pavement. Again, contract allowed up to 539 days. Weber bid 390. Through the rephasing, it was adjusted to 495. And to date, we've charged 230 of those days. And they're on track to hit both the no excuse and max incentive for it as well. Okay, moving into construction progress. These pictures were taken a couple weeks ago. So here at the south end of the project, you can see Weber's working on the last of the pavement tie-ins there for the northbound main lanes. A lot of the frontage road work's really coming together. Go on to the next slide. Here's the 11th 12th Street intersection, so you can really see how it's starting to take shape. This is looking to the west. You can see the new configuration of the intersection with the bond breaker. We anticipate concrete pavement going down probably in early spring in this area. And then just here's another shot looking back to the south. Again, you can really see how that 11th 12th Street intersection is going to look completely different when we're done. Looking to the north towards 4th and 5th, you can see where we recently opened a temporary exit ramp down at the bottom of the page. What that allowed Weber to do was complete the last remaining gap of concrete pavement in this area. And you can see they've graded out the subgrade for the new northbound main lane pavement up to 4th and 5th Street. Here's directly overhead at 4th and 5th Street. You can see on the bottom right of your screen what will be the new 5th Street alignment in front of the Exxon station. It's received bond breaker, and there should be pavement going down in this area, hopefully in the spring timeframe, and really get the 4th 5th Street intersection in its final configuration. Here's overhead at University Parks. Again, you can see where the north U-turn is starting to take shape with bond breaker. The north half of the intersection is starting to take shape with bond breaker, and then the east side of the frontage road there. Again, this is another one that in the spring timeframe will really start to hit its final configuration as well. Brazos River, since this picture's been taken, Weber has started setting panels on that bridge deck. We are looking at probably a late February pour date for that particular bridge. Here's directly overhead at MLK. Again, you can see the new U-turns down below with bond breaker being placed. As far as the structure goes, we've actually poured the southern span of that structure and have a couple more to go once the temperatures kind of warm up for us over the next couple of weeks. And we should have this one wrapped up by the end of January. This is directly overhead at Union Pacific Railroad. This structure has actually been poured since this picture was taken. Again, you can see a lot of bond breaker on the ground. This will be an area where concrete pavement will start to hit the ground as well over the next several weeks. Here's the Business 77 intersection, so another location that has changed dramatically since the beginning of the job. You can see bond breaker for the new configuration on the west side of the intersection, along with some bond breaker underneath the new overpass there. Again, as some of the main lane pavement wraps up over the next several weeks, these intersections will start to take shape in the spring. So looking back to the south at the US 84 intersection, you can see bond breaker on both the east and west side of the intersection for the westbound main lanes. Excuse me. Pavement should be hitting the ground here again over the next several weeks. That 84 structure will be poured actually in a couple of phases beginning next week when temperatures warm up. Okay, looking to the north at Barron's Overpass, you can see a lot of this is really starting to take its final shape. A lot of concrete pavement has hit the ground for the new northbound main lanes. You can see intersection work wrapping up there at Barron's. We are actually targeting in mid-February potentially opening up the northbound pavement from roughly this area up through the north end of the job to go ahead and split traffic and create a little room on the main lanes. And then here's just another overhead shot of the Barron's intersection. Again, you can see it's getting very close to wrapping up. And then at the very north end of the job, you can see concrete pavement placed up to North Loop 340. The last remaining section is there in the middle where we had a leave out to allow a temporary ramp to North Loop 340. Traffic was switched just before the holidays. Weber will be in to pour that last remaining piece and again get it ready for the traffic switch. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on Interstate, Mall to Mall, or any of the other projects.
Do you have a sense of, I know you said concrete will be poured for 11th, 12th, 4th, 5th, and University Parks this spring. Do you have a sense of those kind of opening up multiple lanes each way around that time as well, or a different timeline for that?
So in the spring, I see it more as, maybe getting traffic in its final configuration, but not necessarily multiple lanes. I think as far as multiple lanes, you're probably looking at closer to the Memorial Day timeframe when you really start to see some of that take shape.
At all three of those, you think?
I think they're all three going to be pretty close to the same time frame. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions? Well, thank you. We really appreciate it.
All right, yes, sir. Thanks.
All right, we will move on to our director's report.
Yeah, so the most important thing that I wanted to mention, but we can table it for the next meeting, in the interest of time, it's almost 3:30. Chelsea has been leading the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee for TxDOT. And this is a statewide effort that TxDOT is making. So we'll put it for the February meeting. They meet quarterly, and there are some important steps they're taking. And so we want to actually spend a little bit of time to talk to you and inform you about what is happening statewide. And so we'll table it for the next meeting. And so the most important thing, February 17th at 2 p.m. is our next meeting. We will have several action items at the next meeting, especially from the bylaws, as well as making decisions about the performance targets, and also establishing the strategic planning work group and such. And so if there is any other question that we can answer at this point in time, otherwise we'll hand it back to you.
All right. Do we have any registered speakers for the hearing of visitors?
No.
Okay. Well, again, we want to reiterate a warm and hearty Central Texas welcome to Dr. Kumar as he's joined our community and is boldly leading our MPO here. So welcome and thank you for being here and thank you for leading us on this session. And with that, we will adjourn this meeting at roughly 3:30 p.m. Here. And then, Mr. Mayor, is there any adjournment we need to do with City Council?
Yes, we'll adjourn our City Council meeting at 3:30 p.m.
Thank you all so much.